Chapters 25 and 26 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 25. 1811. The King of Rome. It will be interesting to note how Napoleon was occupied during the last half of this year of 1810, when affairs in the peninsula so urgently demanded his presence there, when France was slowly drifting into war with Russia, and he was showing so much indifference to events in Sweden. From the 6th to the 17th of July he was hunting at Rambouillet, while the obsequies of Lannes were being held with great ceremony at Paris. Perhaps he felt that these honors to the hero of Essling might displease his Austrian bride. On the return to St. Cloud, the usual monotonous court life was resumed, only broken by spectacles and promenades. At this time Napoleon wrote an affectionate letter to his "very dear father-in-law," to announce new probabilities in the case of the Empress. In fact, Marie-Louise, in her own words, "begins to be a little monstrous." The first 10 days of August were passed at Trianon, to which Marie-Louise had taken a great fancy on the occasion of her first visit in June, and the rest of the month was spent at St. Cloud. When Napoleon was not occupied with promenades, audiences, receptions, dinners, balls, concerts, and other social events, he gave hours to revising and making more rigorous the etiquette of the imperial palace. He regulated the places of the kings and princes, decreed the privileges to be accorded to the dukes, counts, and barons, and decided what carriages should be allowed to enter the courts of the palaces. This uneventful existence was continued until the last of September, when the court went to Fontainebleau. This was a repetition of the visit of 1807, but with more pomp and etiquette. The days were spent in hunts and promenades. The evenings were devoted to amusement. 3 times a week there was an opera or a comedy. On other evenings there were receptions, and on Sunday a concert. On Sunday, the 4th of November, Cardinal Fesch baptized in the chapel of the palace all of the children to whom Napoleon, for several years past, had promised to give his name. At the head of the list was the youngest son of Louis and Hortense, the future Emperor Napoleon III. Several years before, Napoleon had ordered made a register in which to record the births of the children of the imperial family, and the name of Charles Louis Napoleon was the first to be inscribed in the book. When the Cardinal demanded, "What names do you give these children?" Napoleon saved himself from embarrassment by producing a written list. All of the children to whom Joséphine was to have been godmother bore the name of Joseph or Joséphine, but the name of the new marraine was Louise. Among the girls who were presented on this occasion was the child of Eugène, Joséphine, the future Queen of Sweden. This ceremony over, on the 16th of November the court returned to Paris, where the pregnancy of the Empress was officially announced. Marie-Louise was glad to leave Fontainebleau, where she had suffered from the cold, and been bored by the everlasting tragedies which Napoleon loved. On leaving Fontainebleau Napoleon intended to go to Cherbourg, where all the plans had been made for his reception, but Marie-Louise insisted upon going with him, so he gave up the trip. Upon his return to Paris, as before, the time of Napoleon was almost entirely taken up with the Empress, and with plans suggested by her coming accouchement. The rooms in the Tuileries set aside for the King of Rome were those previously occupied by Duroc, the Grand Marshal of the palace. They were situated on the ground floor, with most of the windows on the Carrousel, and were parallel to the private suite of the Empress, which faced on the gardens. The apartment had been redecorated and refurnished at an expense of nearly 500,000 francs. But it was necessary to think of a permanent habitation for his son. The king could only live for a few years in the apartment improvised in the palace. First of all, the Emperor thought of Bagatelle, the little château in the Bois de Boulogne, purchased in 1808, but soon a much grander scheme took form in his mind. Some years before, his architect, Fontaine, had prepared plans for an imperial palace to be erected at Lyons at a cost of 10,000,000 francs. When the model was shown to the Emperor, some one made the remark that the building would be much more effective on an elevated site, and the architect at once proposed the heights of Chaillot. This idea, which had been dormant in the mind of Napoleon for several years, now returned to him, and on the 29th November he ordered Fontaine to present to him a project for embellishing the Bois de Boulogne by adding a country seat built upon the summit of the heights of Chaillot. In his mind's eye Napoleon could already see this glorious edifice, reached by a splendid new avenue from the Arc de Triomphe, with the Bois de Boulogne as a park and Bagatelle as a hunting lodge. At that time it would have been easy to carry out the plan, for there were only open fields, with a few scattered houses between the Bois and Chaillot. But all this was for the future. At the present time he wanted a small private garden, reached by an underground passage from the Tuileries, with a pavilion where the child could rest. He asked Fontaine how much this would cost. 500,000 francs, replied the architect. 500,000 francs! I will spend only 20,000. The architects ruined Louis XIV. But this streak of economy was not lasting. At the same moment he was projecting or ordering new constructions in more than half a score of the cities of the Empire. Disliking the Tuileries, regretting the Elysee, which he had given to Joséphine, he was even thinking of remodeling Versailles for his use. To amuse the Empress, who was not interested in building, Napoleon arranged for performances 2 or 3 times a week in the private apartments, generally comedies or light operas. For the étrenne of 1811 he ordered for her a handsome medallion portrait of himself, and the finest specimens of Sèvres and of the Gobelins for her to present to her family. In January, 1811, Napoleon returned several times to his plan for a palace to be erected for the King of Rome, at an estimated cost of 20 millions, and once was on the point of issuing orders to begin the work, but yielded to the criticism of the Minister of the Interior. His idea was to have an edifice superior to all the palaces past and present, and he demanded full particulars regarding the residences of the Roman emperors, as well as all the existing palaces in Europe. The building, which was to be 400 metres in length, was to dominate the heights of Chaillot, where the Trocadero now stands, overlooking the Pont d'Iéna and the Champ de Mars, with the École Militaire in the background. The palace was to be the centre of a group of buildings extending along the river on either side, to house different bureaus of the government. Even after the lapse of a century, this grandiose plan seemed senseless. At the downfall of the Empire, in 1814, nothing had been done beyond clearing the ground and starting on the foundations. When he was not busy with his building plans, Napoleon gave hours to regulating the amusements of the court. Here are the orders for the carnival season. 3 grand masked balls will be arranged for the winter. 1 at the Hôtel of the Prince de Neuchâtel, 1 at the Arch-Chancellor's, 1 at Comte Marescalchi's. During the carnival there will be a grand full-dress ball each week. These balls will be given by Queen Hortense, Princess Pauline, Prince de Neuchâtel, and the Ministers of Police, War, Foreign Affairs, and the Interior. To these balls they will invite all the court and the strangers who have been presented. He then goes on to prescribe even the costumes to be worn on these occasions. In spite of the advanced stage of her pregnancy, the Empress was present at all these functions up to the middle of February, and went out with the Emperor in her carriage as late as the 4th of March. After that date the Empress arranged every fine day to take the air on the terrace bordering the Seine, which had been closed to the public. But it was necessary to pass through a crowd of people, and Napoleon finally gave orders to construct the subterranean passage from the Château to the terrace. With all possible haste, however, it was impossible to complete this work under 2 weeks. On the 15th of March the Grand Duke of Würzburg arrived, to be present at the accouchement of his niece. It was arranged to have an entertainment for him on the evening of the 19th, but when the invited guests arrived at 8 o'clock, they were informed that the pains had begun, and the play would not be given. The persons who were expected to be in attendance at the ceremonies of the birth were ordered to present themselves at the palace without delay, wearing the same costumes as at the Sunday Mass. Soon the brilliantly lighted rooms on the ground floor were crowded by a throng of dignitaries who waited in silence. At midnight a supper was served. About 5 o'clock in the morning the accoucheur, M. Dubois, told the Emperor that the birth would not take place for another 24 hours, so everybody was sent home. Therefore at 8 o'clock in the salon where the members of the family were to assemble, There was no one present except Eugene and Würzburg, who were both living in the chateau; while in the salon reserved for the dignitaries there were only Berthier and Cambacérès. An hour passed, and at 9:20 on the morning of Wednesday, the 20th of March, the child arrived. The excitement in Paris that morning is vividly depicted by Madame de la Tour du Pin in her Journal. The morning of the 20th of March, 1811, we heard the first discharge of the guns of the Invalides. We descended into the street. All the carriages stopped; the merchants upon the thresholds of their shops, the people at their windows, counted the strokes. We heard every one say, 3, 4, 5, and so on. There was an interval of about a minute between each discharge. After the 21st there was a profound silence, but at the 22nd there were spontaneous cries of "Vive l'Empereur!" That evening I dined with my sister, Madame Bertrand, and there we were notified that the child would be privately baptized at 9 o'clock, and that the ladies who had been presented at court could attend the ceremony. Madame Dillon, my sister, and I went. We had to enter the Pavillon de Flore, and pass through all the apartments, as far as the Salle des Maréchaux. The salons were full of the dignitaries of the Empire, men and women. Every one endeavored to be at the edge of the passageway, kept open by the ushers, where the procession was to pass to descend to the chapel. We managed to maneuver so as to find ourselves on the landing of the stairway. From this point we enjoyed a very rare sight, that of the old grognards of the Vieille Garde, arranged in order upon each step, every one wearing the cross upon his breast. They were forbidden to make a movement, but a very vivid emotion was depicted upon their stern faces, and I saw tears of joy in their eyes. The Emperor appeared at the side of Madame de Montesquieu, who bore the child, with his face uncovered, upon a cushion of white satin, covered with lace. I had the opportunity to obtain a good look at him. The marriage contract was no sooner signed in February, 1810, than Napoleon began to think of the title to be borne by his son, the heir of the Grand Empire. None in the traditions of France was suitable, for the ancient provinces had been abolished by the Revolution, and the name of a French city would be a mere courtesy title inferior to the titles of victories borne by the marshals. Only one city was sufficiently universal to typify the grandeur of his empire, and that was Rome, the Eternal City. But he was not content with a merely honorary title for his son. He would therefore take Rome from the Pope, revoking the donation made by Charlemagne, his august predecessor. By the same act he would affirm his possession of the Western Empire, abandoned by the Emperor of Austria on the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire. For over 8 centuries, King of the Romans had been the title of the German Emperor-elect prior to his coronation by the Pope, or the title of his successor if elected during his lifetime. It was only a courtesy title, however, and did not imply possession of Rome. But Napoleon wished his son to be King of Rome, not King of the Romans, and the decree of the 17th of February, 1810, reads: "The Prince Imperial bears the title and receives the honors of King of Rome." The King of Rome was named Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles. Francis for his grandfather and godfather, the Emperor of Austria; Joseph both for his uncle the King of Spain, the second godfather, and the Grand Duke of Würzburg; and Charles for his paternal grandfather. As soon as the birth certificate had been signed, the usher opened wide the double folding doors of the salon, announced the King of Rome, and Madame de Montesquieu appeared with the child. The Emperor himself presented his son at the ondoiement, which was celebrated by the Grand Almoner Cardinal Fesch, assisted by M. de Rohan, the almoner of the Empress. The procession then returned to the state apartments, where the little king was invested with the cordons of the Légion d'honneur and of the Couronne de Fer. The salvos of 101 guns were repeated. There were fireworks in the Place de la Concorde, and all the public buildings, except the Tuileries, were illuminated. Napoleon showed his pleasure by the magnificent donations to all who were connected with the happy event. To Marie-Louise he gave a single string of pearls valued at $500,000. To Dubois, the physician in charge, he presented 100,000 francs, as mark of satisfaction, and later gave him the Star of the Legion and the title of Baron. All of his other gifts were on the same magnificent scale. He also remembered the poor of Paris with a donation of 250,000 francs. The indifference of the public, as shown in the letters and memoirs of the time, was in marked contrast with the official celebrations. The people saw in this birth a supreme favor of destiny to one who for 14 years had succeeded in every enterprise he had undertaken. His life was so much superior to the common existence that it seemed supernatural. His career was viewed with curiosity, with astonishment, with admiration, but without enthusiasm. On Sunday, the 9th of June, the little king was baptized with great pomp in the chapel of Notre Dame. Napoleon himself had arranged even the smallest details of the celebration. For him the baptism was much less a religious ceremony than an enthronement of his dynasty. The custom in France, as pointed out by Champagny, was to have only one godfather, but Napoleon followed the etiquette of the court of Vienna and had 3. The godmothers were Madame Mère and Queen Hortense. The baptism at Notre Dame also was without precedent under the Ancien Regime. The royal children had all been baptized in the chapel at Versailles, since that palace was built; and before that at St. Germain, the Tuileries, the Louvre, Fontainebleau, or the Palais Cardinal, according to the residence of the court. All the credible witnesses attest that, although there was a large crowd to view the procession, there were no cheers, and little enthusiasm was shown. The ceremony at the cathedral was followed by a banquet at the Hôtel de Ville. The following Sunday there was a grand fête at the Tuileries, a review, a state dinner, a concert upon the terrace, and a ball in the apartments. It was first published that on this occasion not only the court, but a very large number of the inhabitants of the city, would be invited. At the last moment, however, it was announced that only persons presented at court would be admitted, and this gave great offense to many who had expected to be present. These fêtes and ceremonies demonstrated how completely Napoleon had abandoned his former democratic ways, which had endeared him to the nation. Between himself and the people he had erected a wall of etiquette which none but the privileged few could pass. Only the court really counted; the official world, a little; the middle classes, not at all. In the many promotions of June, 1811, we do not find the name of a single member of the Institute. Only the officials were invited to the ceremonies; only those presented at court; nearly all ci devant nobles were welcomed at the fêtes. The crosses were all reserved for the former émigrés, who now crowded the Tuileries. The imperial etiquette was more severe than at Versailles in the days of Louis XIV. The Parisians whom Napoleon now took so little pains to placate recalled his effusions of Frimaire en 13 at the début of the Empire, when he said to the corps municipal, "I wish you to know that on the field of battle, amidst the greatest perils, upon the seas, even in the heart of the desert, I have ever in my thoughts the opinion of this great European capital; next to that always the approval of posterity, so strong in my heart." The ceremonies of the baptism also showed how completely Napoleon had broken with his family. He was on bad terms with Lucien, interned in England; with Louis, an émigré in Austria; with Caroline and Murat, who were preparing to set up their independence at Naples; with Joseph, who refused to abdicate; with Elisa, whom he forbade to come to Paris. The only one in his good graces was Jérôme, who submitted tamely to all his demands. Among all the portraits of the baby King of Rome, it is difficult to select the one which was true to life, and to decide whom he resembled. The only one of Isabey which is known was that sent by Marie-Louise to her father, and this was probably flattering. The sketches of Prudhon are doubtless more authentic. He was the painting master of the Empress, and had a better opportunity to observe the child. The head is large, the forehead very high, and the eyes prominent, fleur de tête, like those of the mother. In a letter to Joséphine, Napoleon said that the baby had his eyes and mouth and chest. But the trustworthy portraits all show a strong resemblance to Marie-Louise. The other pictures are only dynastic. The Emperor had adopted for his own effigy an expression quite different from the reality. He had wished to fix in the memory of his people, in a definite fashion, the type by which his subjects should imagine their sovereign. The Emperor, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, must appear to his people majestic, serene and grave, handsome with a beauty almost superhuman, like the deified Caesars. That his portraits resemble his person he cares not. It is enough that the distinctive traits stand out from the paintings, the statues or the monuments, in such a way that no one can fail to recognize him. For his dynasty Napoleon demands the same official type. Every artist who executes the portrait of the child must make of his baby face a juvenile reduction of the imperial visage. In all the paintings, therefore, we find a reproduction of Napoleon, and not of the real Napoleon, but of the typical Napoleon, of whom David, Gérard, and others had formulated the official image. It is impossible to place confidence in these portraits of the King of Rome, as it is to accept those of the Emperor painted after 1805. All that we know of a certainty is that the child was strong and healthy and had a good disposition. He was ever present in the thoughts of the Emperor, by whom he was adored. On the 2nd of May, 1821, at St. Helena, when he was already in the agony of death, Napoleon tried to speak of his son, but the words failed him; and it was upon the portrait of his boy that he fixed his dying gaze, as if he wished to carry this image beyond the tomb. 26. 1811. Daily life of the Empress. The birth of the King of Rome produced one result which Marie-Louise had not anticipated. It broke up the intimate married life which she had led with Napoleon for nearly a year. It was not that the Emperor was less affectionate or less considerate, only that he was no longer so constantly in her company. He resumed his former custom of taking his déjeuner in his cabinet, and dined alone in his apartment. He called more frequent meetings of the Council, and gave a great deal of time to public affairs which he had so long neglected. He also held many reviews of the troops which were beginning to pass through Paris on their way to Germany. He struck off the fetters which had bound him for so many months, and became his former self. As Dubois had informed him that a second confinement would imperil the life of the Empress, he indulged in several passing fancies, which he carefully concealed from the jealous eyes of Marie-Louise. Dubois had acted according to his convictions, and in good faith, but he was entirely mistaken, as subsequent events were to prove. In any case the consequences were most serious, for the birth of other children might have drawn closer the bonds which united them, have prevented their separation, and assured the future of the Napoleonic dynasty. On the 17th April, the Empress went out for the first time. By the new subterranean passage she walked to the terrace on the border of the river, and the following day she drove to the Bois. After the ceremonies of the Relevailles, which, contrary to the custom under the monarchy, were celebrated quietly in the palace, on the 20th of April she went to St. Cloud for the summer. Here their life was calm and uneventful, but Napoleon was unable to devote much time to his wife. Sleeping in a separate room and up at an early hour, he worked until 9 o'clock. Then he took his breakfast alone under the trees in the park, where Marie-Louise usually joined him, and the nurse brought the little King. After caressing the child and playing with him for a short time, Napoleon returned to his work. At 4 o'clock, if the weather was fine, he either drove or rode with his wife for an hour or two. At 7 o'clock they dined together, and not later than 10 Napoleon returned to his desk, where he worked until a late hour in the night. For the first time, therefore, Marie-Louise was thrown almost entirely upon her own resources. Her child occupied but little of her time, as he was constantly with his nurse and governess. This year she passed only 3 months with the Emperor at St. Cloud, the rest of the time being taken up with their trip to the Low Countries. But the 2 following years, when Napoleon was absent in Russia and in Germany, she spent about 6 months at St. Cloud, and nearly all of the remaining time at the Tuileries. Her life was not very different from that which she had led as a young girl at Schönbrunn, or the Burg in Vienna, but with an entire absence of the intimate family associations which she had had there. Her time, regulated to a minute, passed with the monotony of a convent. At 8 o'clock her women drew the curtains, and brought her the Paris morning papers, which she glanced over. She took her breakfast in bed, a cup of coffee or chocolate, and some Vienna Kuchen, which a Paris pâtissier had learned to make. At 9 o'clock she made her toilette, over which she spent but little time. Then her child was brought to her for a few minutes. She took her luncheon with her dame d'honneur, Madame de Montebello, and also her dinner when the Emperor was absent. Unlike Joséphine, she loved to read, and spent much time with her books, which were mainly of a serious or instructive character. In the month of June, 1810, she devoured 18 volumes of Madame de Genlis. Her library, composed of books which she selected herself, shows the tendency of her mind and does her credit. Marie-Louise had brought from home a number of elementary books in German, French, and Italian. As we have already seen, she had received a very good education for a young girl of her time. She wrote French much better than she spoke it; she could never overcome her German accent, and to the last made such mistakes as to say, "Napoleon, qu'est-ce que veux-tu?" On the other hand, as she had little occasion to speak German, she forgot her syntax, and was reproached by her family for her French idioms. She spoke Italian quite well, and at the court of France had little call for other languages. Her instruction, without being very profound, was extended and varied. She had a good knowledge of geography, natural history, and history, particularly of the present and former possessions of the House of Austria. She seems to have been particularly interested in arboriculture, botany, and ornithology, and possessed quite a number of works on these subjects. Like Joséphine, she was very fond of flowers, but she did not have the magnificent gardens and hothouses which were the glory of Malmaison. Her rooms at the Tuileries and St. Cloud were always filled with rare flowers, which she paid for from her private purse. She had always been fond of painting, and at Paris took lessons from Prudhon and Isabey. As Napoleon disliked the odor of oils, she finally gave them up, and confined herself to water-colors and crayons. She was equally interested in music, and her private apartment in all the imperial palaces was furnished by the orders of the Emperor with a harp and a piano, always of the same pattern. These were purchased for her at Vienna, as she preferred the German makes. Her taste in music was excellent, and besides the French and Italian operas, she had in her collection all the German classics. She was also fond of needlework, and had a teacher in embroidery. But even with all these distractions her time was not fully occupied, and she had in her rooms every kind of game imaginable — cards, dominoes, checkers, backgammon, and so on. As has already been intimated, Marie-Louise was a little gourmand, and had the German habit of eating at all hours of the day and night. She had in her apartment numerous appliances for making and serving tea and chocolate. She was very fond of cakes and bonbons, and had a standing order with the most celebrated manufacturers of Paris. There were also the pleasures of out of doors. Like her aunt, Marie Antoinette, she had been deprived as a young girl of the pleasure of riding, and she was anxious to learn. As this met with the approval of the Emperor, she took her first lessons in the riding school at St. Cloud upon her return from Antwerp in 1810. The following year, after her confinement, she was in haste to resume this pastime. At St. Cloud, Compiègne, and Fontainebleau she rode with the Emperor. At Paris she followed the hunt with him in the Bois, or rode for exercise in the Parc of Mousseau. When Napoleon was absent, she rode with Madame de Montebello. Driving also amused her, but not so much, especially at Paris, where the only place was the Bois de Boulogne, with its straight and dusty roads. The only attraction there was the luncheon or tea at Bagatelle, which she enjoyed. At Paris there was no promenade, except upon the reserved terrace of the gardens, until Napoleon recovered the Élysée from Joséphine in exchange for Laeken; but even there she found little pleasure in walking in a small garden enclosed with walls. Such in brief was the daily life of Marie-Louise, about as narrow and confined as that of a young girl in a convent, or an odalisque in a Turkish harem. She could not receive any one without the approval of the Emperor. She could not write freely even to the members of her family, because she knew that her correspondence all passed under the eyes of the "Black Cabinet." For this reason it is necessary to take with a large grain of salt such letters as the following to her father: "If that were possible, my tender love for my husband has increased greatly since the birth of my son. The proofs of attachment which he has given me would have drawn me to him for all time, if his good qualities had not already done so. It is an old saying that 'deeds speak louder than words,' and certainly the attitude of Marie-Louise in the days of misfortune which followed did not show any profound love or attachment for her husband. Napoleon was right when in speaking of Joséphine after her death he said, "She, at least, would never have abandoned me." But in estimating the character of Marie-Louise, we must remember that she was naturally weak. She had always had some one to direct her, some one to lean on, and this was to be her lot throughout life. She had formed a warm attachment to her dame d'honneur, Madame de Montebello, and it was she who controlled her thoughts and actions, in the absence of the Emperor. The Duchesse de Montebello was the widow of Marshal Lannes, killed at the battle of Essling. She had been chosen by Napoleon because he felt that he owed this mark of distinction to one of his oldest and bravest comrades in arms. She was 10 years older than the Empress, a very beautiful woman, cold, calm, and of irreproachable reputation. In appointing her, Napoleon had said, "I am giving the Empress a real lady of honor." This lady, who was the object of the passionate love of Marie-Louise, had from the first deliberately set out to gain the favor of which she calculated the profits. It was she who at Braunau instigated the Queen of Naples to send back Madame Lazenski, and who, by the same stroke, aroused the resentment of Marie-Louise against Caroline. She had made herself useful in deciphering the illegible letters of the Emperor. She had made herself agreeable by expressing great admiration for the House of Lorraine and all its members. She had made herself indispensable during the confinement of Marie-Louise by displaying an energetic devotion which alone had calmed and reassured the patient when she thought her life was in danger. Jealous of her influence, she endeavored not only to prevent Marie-Louise from forming other friendships, but to turn her even against the Emperor. One day, when Napoleon had reproached her for a minor infraction of the rules of etiquette, she exclaimed to Marie-Louise after he had left, "I am very glad that Monsieur l'Etiquette has finished. I never liked long sermons." Napoleon soon realized that he had made a mistake in his selection, but she showed no intention of resigning, and he could not dismiss her without causing a scandal which would reflect upon the glorious memory of his friend. Marie Antoinette had her Madame de Polignac. Marie-Louise had her Madame de Montebello, and the influence of the latter was as nefaste as that of the former. The Montebello made such good use of her opportunities that after her death during the Second Empire, it took 6 sales over a period of 2 months to dispose of the 16,000 objets d'or in her inventory, and an enormous sum was realized. On the 23rd May, with the Empress, Napoleon left St. Cloud to make his long-deferred visit to Cherbourg. The work on the harbor there, begun under Louis XVI, abandoned during the Revolution, had been resumed by Napoleon, and was now nearing completion. Notwithstanding the imminence of the war with Russia, Napoleon still had in mind the project for a descent on England, and he had selected this place as his naval base. On this, as on the 2 previous journeys, Marie-Louise appeared haughty, bored, silent. "A wooden head," said the Normans. She had not a word to say in response to the compliments addressed to her by the authorities, not a smile for the young maidens who offered her flowers. This time, however, there was more excuse for her lack of animation, for this journey, so soon after her confinement, had fatigued her terribly. The first day they were on the road for 19 hours, from 4 in the morning until 11 at night. On 2 other occasions they made journeys of 12 hours. Napoleon, accustomed to the marvelous endurance of Joséphine, and ignorant of the care necessary for a young mother, showed but little consideration for his wife. His mind was full of the grandeur of the plans for Cherbourg, which Vauban had once termed audacious. On the day of his arrival, according to his custom, the Emperor began at an early hour the inspection of the fortifications and the docks. He visited the harbor and the fleet, and lunched with the Empress on the dike. He also went down into the vast basin 40 feet deep, which was to accommodate 50 vessels of the line. As dynamite was then unknown, it had been cut out of the solid rock with picks, which removed only a flake of stone at each stroke. On the 4th of June, after an absence of less than 2 weeks, they were again back at St. Cloud. After the baptism of the King of Rome on the 9th, there was a week of rest, and then it was necessary to return to Paris for the opening of the Corps Legislatif on the 16th of June. This was a very tiresome day, as the opening of the session was followed by a grand banquet in the Salle des Maréchaux, a spectacle in the theatre, and a large reception. The heat was stifling, and Marie-Louise was glad to get back to St. Cloud at midnight. After a fortnight of comparative tranquillity at St. Cloud, on the 10th of July they went to Trianon for 2 weeks, en petit comité, a party of only 21 persons. Among those invited were the wife of Berthier, who was a Bavarian princess, and the Grand Écuyer, Caulaincourt, with whom the Empress could talk German. As in the days of Marie Antoinette, the life was familiar and intimate, and every one enjoyed the relief from etiquette. After another fortnight at St. Cloud, and a week at Rambouillet, where it rained nearly all the time, they returned to St. Cloud in time to go to Paris for the celebration of the Fête of Napoleon on the 15th of August. As none of the princes was at Paris, there was no family dinner as usual, so Napoleon escaped alone with the Empress in the evening. They promenaded the boulevards arm in arm like a pair of lovers, and looked at the illuminations. Marie-Louise was never so amused, and she talked of this escapade years afterward. 10 days later, La Saint Louis, the fête day of the Empress, was celebrated at Versailles. It rained nearly all day, and the heat and humidity were almost unbearable. The illuminations and decorations were ruined, and the day was not a success. 4 days later the court went for a visit of 3 weeks to Compiègne. On the 19th of September, Napoleon started for Holland, leaving the Empress to follow him 2 days later. She seems by this time to have become accustomed to the Emperor's mode of traveling, for she left Compiègne at 2 o'clock in the morning, and reached the Château of Laeken, near Brussels, at the same hour the day following, having lunched at Péronne and dined at Mons. At Brussels, Marie-Louise was received with great enthusiasm by the authorities and by high society as the great-granddaughter of Maria Theresa of Austria, their former sovereign. Many who had not left their hotels to make a call since the Revolution came to pay their homages. One grande dame, in order to make a good appearance, was forced to paint a bay horse black so as to have a matched pair. The memoirs state that to these ladies their Archduchess appeared timid and embarrassed, lacking assurance and good breeding. But she made a good impression by ordering nearly 150,000 francs of lace of the manufacturers who were out of work. After a sojourn of a week, on the last day of the month, Marie-Louise rejoined the Emperor at Antwerp, where he had arrived that morning. "You can easily imagine the pleasure I felt," she wrote. The whole month of October was spent in visiting the principal cities of Holland, where Napoleon, as usual, was occupied from morning to night in his tours of inspection. Marie-Louise, who had lost nearly all her hair and grown very thin, was fatigued beyond expression. The 1st of November they left Holland for the banks of the Rhine. But on the 4th, at Cologne, on receipt of urgent despatches from Paris, the Emperor decided to return home at once. He hardly allowed Marie-Louise a few hours to see the cathedral and the city, and then set out. At 7 o'clock on the evening of the 11th of November they reached St. Cloud, where they were welcomed by the princes and the grand dignitaries of the Empire, as well as the King of Rome, in the arms of his governess. End of chapters 25 and 26.